Hi there everyone. So for this little video, we're going to try to sort of give an overview of Kant's work in hopes of sort of contextualizing the Prolegomena, the text that we're going to be reading together from Kant, so we can sort of make better sense of it. So I've written out a little bit of a timeline here. There's a bit of a glare, but I'll try to fill in the blanks as much as possible. Make sure that I'm reading it aloud so that y'all can get it, just in case you can't read my handwriting as well. And then we're just going to sort of talk about the general structure of Kant's philosophical system. Now, the most important, I think, association that you'll hear with Kant is that Kant brought forward what we call critical philosophy. And here by critical, we mean in contrast to a period, namely like before Kant's major innovation, the Critique of Pure Reason. We refer to his work before this year, 1781, as being pre-critical. And so what that means, at least in this context, is really just that Kant develops his own philosophical system that he calls the critical system. He sort of discovers how to put it in 1781, and that before that, he was sort of a follower of Wolffian and Leibnizian philosophy. Now, it's important to say, however, that Kant's basic conception of what critique is, what a critical system is something that undergoes a whole lot of change over time. So we're not reading the Critique of Pure Reason, mostly because that book is too difficult. The book is very, very hard, and it's like, depending on your edition, like 700, 800 pages long, right? But this is where Kant sort of systematically goes through his own discovery of a new philosophical method. And in that book, he tries to treat and address all of the major problems of metaphysics. So the discussion of causality that we've gone through basically this entire semester, he thinks he solved it. Discussions about God, he thinks he solved it. The nature of space and time, he thinks he solved it, right? And that he has discovered a principled approach for systematically going through and solving all of these problems. So this is really developed in the Critique of Pure Reason, which is a much longer book, one that we're not going to read for the context of this class. However, if you're interested, then I believe that a class on the Critique of Pure Reason might be offered next semester. I think it's like a 400, 500 level course. If you do well, in this class and you are interested, then I recommend it. It'll definitely expand your horizons to be able to take on a text that's so difficult. And even though it is very challenging, I think that it will definitely help you in terms of understanding basically all Western philosophy that comes afterwards. So I highly, highly recommend, thinking about taking it if you're, a major and want to know a whole lot more about this period. Now, so people will also refer to the Critique of Pure Reason as the first critique. And this is because Kant ended up publishing 3 books that, sort of go critique of, the first one's Critique of Pure Reason, then it's Practical Reason, and then it's Judgment. And we'll talk about why it's those in particular. I can see the glare is kind of bad. This says reason here. So sometimes people will say first critique instead of the Critique of Pure Reason, even though Kant at this point didn't know that he was going to be ending up writing 3 of them. Now, to know sort of why Kant thought that he had to write 3 of them is to get a little bit into what the idea of the critique is. Now, Kant has this idea, basically, that we have different sorts of cognitive faculties, and that these cognitive faculties are governed by principles, right? Principles that are a priori, principles that hold true independently of whatever it is that we happen to experience. And so, in some ways, sort of following on this Humean bent, right? Hume wanted to write a treatise on human nature. So, Kant, too, is engaging in a critique where he's trying to discover the a priori principle that governs all of the faculties of the human mind, right? And so, similarly to Hume, Kant is trying to go through sort of like all of the sources of our knowledge and try to give a systematic answer about how far, you know, knowledge that you get from that source can extend, right? And so I've written here that a critique is a tribunal, and this is how he characterizes it in the Critique of Pure Reason in the preface or the introduction to that work. Is he describes it as like a court, right? And so in the same way that a court would sort of assess the rightful claims made by legal claimants, right, about like whether or not you have the right to certain land or whatever, right? So the critical system will sort of stand over philosophical claims, metaphysical claims, as in like a trial, right? And so we're going to assess the rightful claims made by the science that we call metaphysics, right? And here too, you can see a lot of similarities with Hume. Both Kant and Hume sort of envision interrogating the claims of metaphysics, right? Interrogating the claims of metaphysics chiefly by examining it from a human perspective, right? But what's going to be different is that Kant is going to claim that human reason actually extends further than Hume thinks, and that it must extend further in order for us to make sense of developments in, the natural sciences, right? That Hume is so skeptical that his skepticism ends up undermining the sciences that we know have made progression, namely physics and mathematics, right? In the name of attacking a science that hasn't made the same sort of progression, which is metaphysics, right? The way that Kant sort of portrays the history of metaphysics is as a history of warring parties, right? And so these are sort of how Kant is interpreting debates about metaphysics, like, for instance, whether or not God exists or what the nature of God is, right? And the reason why these are endless battles for Kant is that there's no principled way to end them, right? To decide in favor of one or the other, right? And so part of what Kant endeavors to do in the critical system and in the Critique of Pure Reason is to really examine why. Why is this the case? Why is it that some debates where we use a priori methods, like in mathematics and to some extent in physics, right? Why are those uses of a priori principles successful? But it appears that the extension of a priori principles into metaphysics doesn't work, right? That it seems to produce nothing but these endless, fruitless debates in metaphysics about the nature of God or whatever, right? Okay, and so what the Critique of Pure Reason really tries to do is to give an examination of the cognitive faculties. So here, Kant is exclusively interested in questions about what we can know, right? And so this firmly places the Critique of Pure Reason within theoretical philosophy, if you recall the distinction that Hume made at the beginning of the Enquiry. So the critique of pure reason is concerned with what we can know, right? And as you might be able to gather from the title, part of the investigation is going to be an argument against the use of pure reason, like in the way that Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz tried to use reason alone in order to understand the fundamental nature of reality. That's going to be an argument that gets critiqued in the critique of pure reason. So you might be thinking at this point, okay, we're talking a whole lot about a book that we're not reading, right? So how does this relate to the book that we're actually reading, right? The Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. Okay, well, so what happens is Kant publishes the first edition, what we call the A edition of the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. And, you know, he thinks he's solved every problem in philosophy, right? So he's sort of like sitting around waiting for the reception where everyone is going to be like, hooray, you did it, right? And yeah, I guess that's sort of like what he's expecting, right? So instead, the first review comes out, and it's called the Garva Feder Review. And it's not very important for you to like have this memorized. I'm not going to ask a question about these random German reviewers of Kant, right? But it's just sort of, it helps you contextualize the knowledge that you have. So there's only one review that comes out, and it's very critical of Kant. They interpret Kant in a certain way that we're going to talk about in more depth. But they sort of interpret Kant as saying similar things as Berkeley, right? Namely, they interpret him as saying that all of the objects that exist are just things that exist sort of like in our heads or something like that. Anyway, this pisses Kant off. He's very, very unhappy with how they choose to interpret him. And so he writes this book, this smaller book. Yours is in your textbook, but I have my own little copy here. Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. And so you might be thinking, what is prolegomena, right? Prolegomena is just sort of like a preface, like a short little explanation prior. So, you know, you might think about Prolegomena to any future metaphysics as sort of like notes for any future attempt at doing metaphysics or something like that. And the reason why Kant wrote this book is because he thought that the Garva Feder review misunderstood him so badly that he needed to like sort of write a shorter, more popular version of the Critique of Pure Reason. So that's what we're reading, right? We're reading a shorter, more popularized version of the Kant's Critique of Pure Reason that he wrote in response to a specific kind of misunderstanding. He continues publishing, and that was published in 1783. The Garva Feder Review happened in 1782. Kant publishes some other things during this period that are actually like extremely important works in the history of philosophy, but they're just not really the sort of things that we're interested in now. He waits a few years, and then he publishes a second version of the Critique of Pure Reason in 1787. So he thought that this book was so misunderstood that he actually published two different versions of the book. They have a lot in common, but he chose to rewrite certain sections explicitly to sort of stave off some misunderstandings that we're going to talk more about in a bit. And then eventually in 1788 and then 1790, he wrote the second and the third critiques. So the reason why we're not really reading these second or third critiques or examining them at all is because they're not concerned with theoretical philosophy, which is the main theme of this course, right? Theoretical investigations into the nature of God, our knowledge, and you know, the mind-body problem and so on, right? The Critique of Practical Reason is really about morality. It's about the nature of our action, how we use different faculties when we engage in moral reasoning. So we're not concerned with what we know, but we're concerned with what we should do, right? And so Kant thinks that you use the same faculties of the mind, the same powers that we're going to talk more about in a little bit, but you use them slightly differently. And then finally, he ends up writing a third one that's sort of about specifically human experiences like beauty, right? Beauty and life. And those are sort of the themes of the third critique. I outlined this just so that you have a kind of knowledge of like, okay, well, here is the full scope of what Kant tries to do, right? He tries to give you principles governing all of our knowledge. He tries to give us principles governing all of our actions and provide an explanation for that. And he tries to give us the principles involved in even aesthetic experiences, right? Even beauty, he thinks, is something that's governed by an a priori principle that the critical system can examine, right? And so this is very sort of interesting, is that he tries to give a systematic analysis of all of the powers or capacities of the human mind and to examine their rightful place. And so that's going to be it for this video. In the next video, we're going to try to talk more about Kant's transcendental idealism and the question of the possibility of metaphysics.